And I think for many of us, we took our eye off the ball. We went on and did other things. You know, we turned into our groups, we worked on our particular issues, whether it was communication or whatever. So we took our eye off the big balls in the world of Australian disability rights campaigning. And really, to be honest with you, my analysis would be that during the late 80s and most of the 90s and much of the first decade in the 21st century, things haven't been good in Australia. You know, it's been quite a shock to me and a surprise when I've come back and done a bit of an audit. I think ministers after Don Grimes really ignored disability when you look at it. Who were the ministers for disability? It's very hard to even name them. I mean, they certainly weren't working on rights issues as far as I could tell. As I alluded to, we allowed new models of institutionalisation to emerge. We thought we were campaigning for the right thing. I can remember when the first community residential unit submission came to the Myer Foundation, even in 1982, and we funded it really happily, thinking that this was a radical change to set up a group home. And of course, you know, the abuse in group homes, the locked fridges where you can't even get stuff out of the fridge to eat, the locked doors where you can't go out, the lack of choice as to who you're going to live with, the combination of the support and the accommodation, so you can't leave your accommodation because you lose your support. I mean, everything is wrong with group homes, but we didn't know that then. Cluster housing emerged, which of course turned into ghettos of people with disabilities. In some states, the numbers of special schools grew. We thought we'd sort of changed all that special schools, the people who were educated as special educators, were going to become the reform group for mainstream schools and really help mainstream schools do well so that any mainstream school could accept a child with disabilities and do brilliantly. But no, we looked back over those decades and special schools had grown in number in many states. So really, there was a downslide in disability rights and I'm going to come to the school issue a bit more later. But what came into the gap, and I don't want to be too controversial here, but what filled the gap was a really strong emergence of what I call carers' rights movement. And there is a case for families and people who care for people with disabilities being part of the disability rights movement, absolutely. In fact, I think that's incredibly important. And I want to discuss that because it's a really important shift lately. But to have a movement about carers' rights, the trouble with it was that the person with disabilities became the sort of object, if you know what I mean, so that they became almost depersonalised as the burden that this other movement had to deal with. And that's why people with disabilities get nervous about carers' rights being the predominant issue, because nobody wants to be seen as a burden. We want to be seen as fully participating in a rights movement that combines both groups. So the carers' rights movement filled the gap in the 90s, and it really was about a splitting in some ways, because quite a lot of bitterness came out of that, of splits between disability rights, feeling weak, not having a voice, and carers' rights having a voice, but always about the misery and the difficulty. And it's quite a fine distinction, because there is misery and difficulty when you don't get the services and you don't get the supports that you need. But on the other hand, characterising people with disabilities as causing misery and causing terrible lives is really difficult for people to swallow, and that was the cause of the splits. So the Labor government, I don't mean to sound so partisan, but as it happens, it has been two Labor governments that have pushed the rights ahead, although I think the Liberal government is the Liberal Party is terribly important to where we're at now, and I'll explain that. But the Labor government that came in late 2007 brought with it two people, and I don't mean to personalise, but Don Grimes was incredibly important as an individual back in the early part of the Hawke government. He'd been in opposition with disability very seriously, taken it very seriously. He'd learnt everything there was to learn. He had excellent advisors, and he really took action. We were given a parliamentary secretary called Bill Shorten, who hadn't been groomed for the position. He wasn't the shadow. I think he was as surprised as us that he was given disability. We had a very experienced senior minister in Jenny Macklin who had learnt a lot about disability, so her name should be mentioned too. But Bill came as an organiser, as the former Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, with very different views about mobilising and campaigning. And also Bill came, really wanting to get his head around these issues. And I suppose you could say Bill came wanting to do his best with this issue that he'd been given, even if he would say, quite frankly, that he wasn't sure that that was what he would have wanted as his first sort of portfolio in the new Labor government. And he made a maiden speech that we hadn't heard. Don Grimes's maiden speech back in the early 80s was very strong, but Bill Shorten's was in some ways stronger, because he expressed his absolute shock at the terrible state of disability in Australia in his maiden speech in Parliament. He said, "I make no apologies for seeing disability as an issue of basic civil rights." And he said, "I believe it is the last frontier of practical civil rights in this country." And he went on to talk about it being the most neglected area, a completely forgotten area in Australia. And it was truly, a landmark speech. And Bill then went on to get out and about in a campaigning mode. It was sort of, people had mixed reactions. If only he'd choose a little more, if only he wouldn't accept every invitation. But when you look back on his time as parliamentary secretary, he was a campaigner. He was a man who was trying to rally Australia to do something about a situation that he saw, that he found to be completely unacceptable. And he said that from every corner of Australia, thousands of times. I think he would have made thousands of speeches. Meanwhile, we also had the highly strategic Jenny Macklin working very systematically around transforming the scene. At the same time, in the early part of the Labor government, the 2020 summit was held, and a guy called Bruce Bonney-Hady went to that with an idea that he'd been working on to create a very new reform agenda for Australia called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So that was happening. Bill and Jenny set up a council that we'd never seen before. The National Disability Advisory Council had been quite a low level, low functioning council. I can remember meeting the previous chair to beg her to try and get the government to pass the building standards, that had been sitting on Philip Ruddock's desk for about 2 years. Why couldn't that council campaign for that? And she told me that they couldn't do anything unless the minister allowed them to do things, and he didn't want them to range wide into building access, which was sort of incredible. So Macklin and Shorten set up a very serious advisory council that many of us were a bit shocked about. I was shocked about it, because they put, we had the mantra, only consumers or carers on a council. They said, no, we're going to put business leaders, trade union leaders, top media people, you know, consumers and carers will have the numbers, they'll have the majority, but we're going to put other leaders in Australia on the council, because that's the way to mobilise and get things done. And so they did, and I think they were right, because it helped to take the message far and wide and away, you know, into networks that have to hear what the reform agenda is. Then the second thing Macklin and Shorten did was that they transformed an expectation for a national disability strategy. It was in Labor Party policy that a strategy would be done. And I honestly think that if we'd had a different minister and a different parliamentary secretary, that strategy might have been done quickly, might have been put in the back drawer, you know, as a report, might not have become the significant strategy it has now. But they gave permission, and council had the idea to do a major consultation around Australia, and then most importantly to publish a report called the Shut Out Report that really told it how it was in Australia. And Shut Out documents all the things that are wrong with disability today. And I can go into detail about what's in it, but really the importance of the report is that it's an Australian government-owned report. It's the first report that an Australian government has owned with their logo on it, their forward in it, that says that things are disgraceful, that from early intervention, which is called barely intervention, you know, that we know that it works and we know people aren't getting enough. Like, that's a big thing for an Australian government to say, because once you've said that in a report of this kind, then the next question is, well, what are you going to do about it? We said that education was completely scandalous. This is in the report. That children with disabilities aren't learning in school to their maximum. That they're not coming out of schooling with everything that they should have learnt to be able to get a job and take a place in Australian society. That they're largely being babysat and being kept quiescent and quiet in classrooms, and the teachers aren't being trained to teach children, which includes children with disabilities. That every single teacher in Australia by now should be able to teach all children. That this fantasy of the normal child is still alive and well and doing us all such a disservice. That schools aren't equipped to be able to accept all children with disabilities. And in fact there are many discriminatory strategies used by schools to push children with disabilities out. And so on and so forth. All this is documented in Shut Out. Then through to jobs, because, you know, if education fails, then jobs are going to fail, and add to that the systemic discrimination and the fact that that public sector jobs have halved for people with disabilities in most states except South Australia actually, but certainly at the Commonwealth level they've halved. And then right through to buildings, transport, the report analyses everything, and I tell you, it's a disastrous reading. If you want to read something that talks about disaster, get the Shut Out report.